What is going on, OWS Fam, DFS Fam, YouTube Fam? Welcome to a travel edition, week 12, actually not week 12, Thanksgiving edition of the DFS Lab. I am JM to win. He is Keegan. We will be talking about the Thanksgiving slate, building a roster, and talking through some of the angles on it to get a feel for how we might want to attack this slate. So with that, let's get started.
1 week season.
Keegan, I got a story for you. So I see that you have your Draftkings pulled up, ready to go for when we build a roster.
I do.
I have had my Draftkings account as of this morning permanently deleted by Draftkings.
What?
So on Sunday morning, I was going to put in my roster. Obviously, I'm traveling. You know that. Audience can see that. So background for any of you who are new here or aren't aware of this, I live in Oregon where you cannot enter DFS Draftkings lineups. In order to comply with things, people always say, why don't you just have somebody else enter your lineups for you? Well, I'm like, well, I want to just comply with things so I don't run into any issues. In order to comply with things, I literally fly to Oakland every week on Tuesday or Wednesday to reserve my lineups in a legal manner, in a legal state, and then adjust them from Oregon. Never an issue. We're in a Airbnb outside of Branson, Missouri, and there's something with the internet here to where Draftkings is reading it as like me trying to mask my location. And so Sunday morning, I got locked out of my account twice as I was trying to change my lineups and enter everything and make my decision. So usually I shop through my 150 lineups to select my single entry 3-max. What I had time for on Sunday morning was just like pick numbers. It was like, all right, roster 36. And I would like scroll down to that and enter that in the power sweep. Then it'd be like roster 47. And I'd scroll down to that and enter that in the power sweep.
Yeah.
Just because I had to be back and forth with Draftkings, I got locked out of my account multiple times. They then told me on Sunday morning, they're like, there's this flag on your account now. So if this happens again, you'll be locked out for a longer span of time and there's nothing we can do about it. And so I've kept that back and forth going throughout Sunday, throughout Monday, throughout Tuesday with customer support to like keep trying to figure out what the issue is and basically let them know, like, you should be able to see I'm in one location this whole time. I'm not moving anywhere. And yeah, as of this morning, locked out of my account. So not super concerned about it. I have a relationship with Jason, who's the CEO of Draftkings. It would be sort of a weird reason to leverage that relationship and hit him up. But if it comes to that, that'll be my solution later in the week. So I currently can't even pull up like Draftkings, but I have looked at pricing and worked through this slate with content. So yeah, that's my story. What about you? How are things on your end?
Wow, man. Nothing that I have to say compares to that. The level of chill you have right now is ridiculous. I would be sweating so hard in your position.
Well, they've got to figure it out. I mean, I feel like DraftKings customer support, generally speaking, is really good. And then on top of that, like I run a content site, so it's valuable to them to get me up and running in that regard. But yeah, I'm curious to see. It's Wednesday, so I'm curious to see if I'll be able to play the Thanksgiving slate. But I would imagine that by Sunday I'll be up and running.
Yeah, but I mean, even if in the back of your mind you're like, this will get resolved. It's just like the feeling of like, damn, my account is down right now.
the amount of like stuff that I'm just carrying around in the back of my mind with like running the business and all the money that moves around with like starting up a business like this and all that. I guess I'm just used to just compartmentalizing things and moving on from it, which is where I'm at with this one. But yeah, I actually do have, so funny, from my writing up the DFS interpretations for this slate, I actually still have Draftkings pulled up on my computer for this slate and can see the pricing. Obviously won't be able to enter anything. But I'm supposed to be writing up my DFS interpretations for the main slate today, and literally can't like pull up Draftkings. So I'm gonna have to like create a dummy account under Abby's name just to have access to the slate and be able to see pricing and all that for writing content. But yeah, strange position to be in. And shout out to Draftkings for having good customer service. Apparently shout out to them for being really vigilant and on top of people entering with like VPNs and masked. Yeah, but I have no idea what's going on because they were like telling me what to delete from my computer And I'm like, no, this is, I have two different phones, like one that has like a phone connection and one that I just use for additional stuff, right? Like on Wi-Fi. So I'm like, this is happening from 3 devices. It's happening from my computer, from 2 different phones. It's happening on 5G. It's happening on Wi-Fi. So I have no idea what's going on. But yeah, I'm in a weird Bermuda Triangle, I guess, outside of Branson, where don't come to Branson and play DFS.
Strange location, yeah. Jeez.
Lesson learned. Speaking of, are you coming to Branson with us next weekend?
I am not. My wife has to work on Black Friday night. I have to watch my.
That's this weekend though. Next weekend, the Marrero clan's coming out here.
I don't know.
Were you uninvited? Were you not invited to that?
I think we were invited. There's so much going on. I just kind of let Reagan decide that part for us.
I understand that.
Sounds terrible.
I know what you mean. For a large part, like my vibe, I was talking to Poppy about this the other day. Like he was like, yeah, I'm the same way. It's just like, tell me what's happening and I'll be there.
Yeah, exactly.
Just a generally easier way to, yeah.
Like what like the least, like the easiest path of resistance, you know, like the least path of resistance.
Yep. And the less I have to put on my plate from like a scheduling standpoint with family stuff. Well, if you decide to come, your parents are getting an Airbnb. Mimi and Poppy are getting an Airbnb. So come hang out with us next weekend.
Together podcast.
doing some double Branson on this trip. So
yes,
some double DraftKings entry issues apparently. All right. I know that people like kind of personal talk, get to know us a little bit, but people probably are really here for the DFS stuff.
Yeah,
so,
we've been going on for like 5 minutes about just
this Thanksgiving slate, which I may or may not be able to play. You had a chance to look at it. Do you typically play the Thanksgiving slate?
I don't.
Okay, actually. Nice. It's actually one of my answers in the Oracle, which is for Inner Circle members. Which, by the way, let me pull up this real quickly and share my screen. But on the site, we've got a bunch of Black Friday stuff going on. Share screen. All right, Black Friday. Go to the oneweekseason.com. Click on the Black Friday link. You'll see all of our deals on this page. So one of those deals is $49 Inner Circle for the rest of the season. So if anybody has been watching these shows and has not jumped into anything OWS, cool way to check that out. But the Oracle is an Inner Circle piece where we answer some key strategy questions for the slate. We had a Thanksgiving edition. I was going through my answers last night, and I was saying I always think I'm not going to play this slate, and then I always end up playing it. And that's sort of the mindset I enter with, just because it's like we always travel for Thanksgiving, and then there's like this is the second biggest football day for like viewership behind the Super Bowl. So it's like a big slate for DFS. And so we make a big deal out of it content wise. And then we have the Black Friday stuff that I'm dealing with on the business side. And then there's still the main slate to get ready for in terms of content preparation. And you lose Thursday with family stuff. So I always think like, this week's too packed, I'm not going to play. Then I always end up playing. And it's generally been like a pretty wildly profitable slate for me. 2020, I took down first place in the Game Changer in the Thanksgiving slate. So I feel like it's a good opportunity for us to kind of talk about how we attack this 3-game slate. And what's interesting about it is we always want to think about storytelling with our rosters in terms of like, rather than just picking players, we want to say, what is the story that we're telling? We always want to think about how we can get a little bit unique and different. But the smaller the slate gets, the more powerful those components are. So as an example of what I mean, in that 2020 slate where I took down first in the Game Changer, that year the Thursday night game got canceled because of COVID. So it was just a 2-game slate. And the Cowboys and Commanders, who were the Washington football team at the time, Cowboys and Commanders were playing on that slate. Everyone was on Ezekiel Elliott. His projected ownership was like 60 to 70%. Andy Dalton was starting for the Cowboys. So whether people realized it or not, the story they were telling was Cowboys control this game. They try to hide Andy Dalton. This game stays close. They keep the ball on the ground. Ezekiel Elliott smashes. Otherwise, you're not rostering him at 60, 70% ownership. So I decided to tell a story of the Commanders take control of this game and take a lead and force the Cowboys to throw, which would basically be a situation where Ezekiel Elliott becomes not very valuable. And then with Andy Dalton throwing the ball, maybe the Commanders, are able to just take a lead and the Cowboys become less valuable as a whole. So I had Antonio Gibson, who ended up going for like 120 yards and 3 touchdowns. And he was like about 20% owned, which is still pretty high, but on a 2-game slate, that's really low, right? Meanwhile, Zeke, because the Cowboys, they lost 41-16, Zeke put up 3.9 DraftKings points. So it wasn't so much that I was saying like the decision, so many decisions were made for me by making one decision. My decision was I'm going to tell a story of the Commanders controlling this game. And once I made that one decision, it was like several boxes were checked for me of how to build that roster. So I think that mindset makes things a lot easier on a small slate like this. And it's good practice for how to play showdowns, good practice for how to play other short slates, and even how to play the main slate in a plus EV manner, is being able to say, okay, what's the story I want to tell? And then you just sort of fill out the roster with that story. And so by telling that one story, it wasn't like, okay, I'm going to fade Zeke, I'm going to play Antonio Gibson, I'm going to do, like, I wasn't making the decision like that. It was just like, I'm telling the story, and that builds the roster on its own. And then that ends up being the story that plays out. You end up winning. So yeah, that's I think one of the key things to think about on this slate. One of the hard things on this slate is the stories that we might tell are pretty likely to play out, right? Like the Lions are 7.5-point favorites. The Cowboys are 11-point favorites. The 49ers are 7-point favorites. So it's like, how different can you get with the storytelling? So we also want to think about like, what are the unique things that other people might not do? Like maybe Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery on a roster together, right? Where they've combined for 40+ points back-to-back games. I think right around, I think it's like 40 and 46 the last couple of games. And Christian McCaffrey, most games this season, he's kind of in that like 18 to 22 point range. So it's not like, oh man, but what if McCaffrey goes for 35 and we're just left in the dust? So that's one way to get different this week. Another way to get different is leaving some salary on the table. Another way to get different is just like, what are the, and if you're a member of OWS or just any other site, you can look at ownership projections for this slate and kind of be like, okay, what are the value plays everybody's on? And then let me just be on different value plays. So yeah, finding some ways to be a little bit different, especially if the stories we're going to tell might be the same stories everybody else is telling. So yeah, that's a lot on my end. Any thoughts piggybacking off of that?
Yeah. Just like in you talking, I kind of thought like this, like Thanksgiving slate is probably really beneficial for players like you, where you don't always necessarily look at the ownership projections. And you more so like, obviously a lot of DFS players tell a story and they base their lineups around that story, but you really emphasize that in a lot of your content and the way you play DFS as a whole. So I think this slate is definitely beneficial towards you, and I think you could help a lot of other players.
I will say, on this type of slate, I actually lean into ownership projections a little bit more. That year with the game changer win, the internet wasn't working at Mimi and Poppy's house, so I had to get a room at the Hampton Inn down the street in Claremore, and was like back and forth, like driving over there to create my content. And it was the night before, Thanksgiving, and I'd finished all my content, was about to head back. And I was like, let me spend a couple hours working on a roster. And what I did was I went to ownership, saw how high owned Zeke was expected to be. And then I just started thinking like, what are the ways that this story could end up, like the story that everybody else is inadvertently telling, what is the ways that it could end up breaking for them? And it was like, well, Commanders control this game. So I just kind of told that story. So there is a component on a slate like this of maybe leaning a little bit more into ownership projections than normal, in order to get that sense of like, okay, what is everybody else saying on this slate? And how do I tell a different story than that?
Okay. So you want to be, well, obviously everybody wants to be different. You want to get different, but I don't know. I don't play the slate, so it's a little weird for me. Ownership projections, like you said, 60% owned. Obviously, that's like a huge amount on a Sunday. But for the Thanksgiving slate, what does that look like? What would that be compared to on a Sunday slate? Would that be like 20%?
So we've got this right here. We've got this is Wednesday afternoon ownership projections on 1 week seasons. This will change by tomorrow morning, but Dak Prescott 29%, Brock Purdy 19.3, Goff 15.7, Geno 12.7, Love 12.1, Howell 11.3. And then we've got Actually, this is pretty interesting where we talk about the potential for like a double Lions build, where you got Christian McCaffrey at 45%, Pollard at 38.6%. Zach Charbonnet with the expectation. I actually haven't looked at news this morning to see if there's any updates on Kenneth Walker, but expectation that Kenneth Walker will be out. So Charbonnet at 28.5%. If we have no Antonio Gibson, this Brian Robinson ownership will likely hold 23.6%. But Gibbs 33.3%, David Montgomery 20.6%. Again, like if McCaffrey only scores 20, which has kind of been his typical game this year, I can't pull up his game logs on my end because I don't have access to DraftKings. But you pull up his game log, you see he's typically in this like low 20s range. If he puts up another score like that, both Lions running backs could put up a similar score at a much lower price tag and lower ownership and just a unique structure there. AJ Dillon 20%. So one of the things that I would start seeing here is like, okay, let's put it like this. Clearly, I almost played Tommy DeVito stacks last week because they were playing Washington. You know what I mean? I ended up playing 12% Darius Slayton last week, and he put up 18.2 DraftKings points and left the game in the third quarter. Like this is how bad this Washington defense has been. Clearly, Dak to CeeDee Lamb is the best stack on this slate, right? So the fact that we're seeing, and this might change, right? But the fact that we're seeing Dak at 29%, but then all these like the other 70% is these other five quarterbacks. It almost looks like the field is expressing too little confidence in Dak. And so one way to build is to say, this is for if you're playing like single entry 3 max, which is what I play on the Thanksgiving slate. If you're playing MME, obviously you take all the different angles, but one way to build would be to say, well, Dak is far and away the best play, and I would take that at 30% ownership and then see where I can get different in other spots, right? Because raw points are going to matter more on this slate than salary multipliers. So if Purdy puts up, a 24-pointer and Dak puts up a 28-pointer, some people might be like, oh, well, salary multipliers, it's about the same. But like the 28-pointer is just more valuable because there's going to be fewer 28-point scores on a slate like this. So I would always think about raw score on a slate like this. And that's kind of where I think the trap that people, not to say that McCaffrey can't hit for 30 plus, but the trap that people could fall into with CMC is saying like, oh, well, CMC is clearly going to put up the top raw score at running back. But when you look through his game logs, that really hasn't been the case this season.
He's got 25. He's hit 25 points 4 times this year, like 25 plus.
Okay. And that's out of, 10 games that they've played so far this year. So, that kind of gives a sense of, that's over half of his games that is finishing below 25 points, a couple of them with around 14 points. So obviously he has that upside within his range. But I think something we've talked about is his usage isn't old CMC usage. It's not 10, 11, 12 targets. It's like he's averaging about 17, 18 carries a game. He's averaging, around 5 targets a game, which is basically the same workload that a lot of these other guys see. It's the same workload while Tony Pollard's carries are down since the first part of the season, but it's like kind of the same workload that Pollard was seeing earlier in the year. Obviously, CMC is a much better player. His role in the red zone is like really not much better than Pollard's, but he's much better himself in the red zone. But you're like putting so many eggs in the basket of like CMC is a really good player at super high ownership. So I think that's one of the places where you could zig where other people are zagging. If you end up going like Dak and CMC, then you got to think about where you're going to get different in other spots on your roster. CeeDee Lamb, 34%. Honestly, like if this were on the main slate, 34% CeeDee Lamb wouldn't at this price tag, like that would almost make sense, 34% CeeDee Lamb on the main slate. Amon-Ra St. Brown, only 3 games this year above, I believe it's only 3 games above 22 DraftKings points. So he's so good. He's such a central part of their offense, but he's not like a Tyreek Hill or what CeeDee Lamb has been two of his last 4 games with those 40-pointers. He's not a Jamar Chase. Like he's not going to put up one of these. He has one 40-pointer. It's like a 39-pointer on his ledger throughout his career. And everything else has been kind of these low 30s and then these like mid-teens to high teens, low 20s. So seeing Amon-Ra St. Brown at the same ownership as CeeDee Lamb is another thing that should stand out to us. So this could be a week where obviously this still like Dak plus CeeDee Lamb is still about 25% of a tournament field in what we're seeing here. So it's not like you're automatically carving out a path to first place, but we do kind of see you can play optimal on this slate in single entry 3 max and not feel like you're just like drowning in ownership alongside everybody else. Terry McLaurin, here's a crazy stat I pulled up last week. Sam Howell, who we know Washington throws the ball a ton. Sam Howell, 24 pass attempts inside, I believe it's 24 inside the 10-yard line heading into last week. 9 different pass catchers on Washington had targets inside the 10. Nobody had more than 5 targets. And that was, I believe, Logan Thomas had 5 targets. And then like the next 2 guys were Curtis Samuel and Jahan Dotson with 4. And then like Brian Robinson with 2 or 3 and McLaurin with 2. So it's like they spread the ball around so much. Only one instance all season of a Washington pass catcher going over 100 yards. So again, Terry McLaurin, like, you might get that nice salary multiplier, 17, 18 points, but can he put up 30? Probably not. So yeah, I mean, just like a lot of different ways to get different this week. And then we can kind of look down at the value range and see, okay, Juwan Jennings is never going to put up like a 20-pointer. Khalif Raymond, Josh Reynolds is interesting. Josh Reynolds still playing about 60 to 70% of the snaps. And, could end up with one of these. He had a 23-pointer earlier in the year with Amon-Ra St. Brown playing where he had 60, I think it was 5 catches, 66 yards, and 2 touchdowns. So he's capable of a game like that. Jalen Tolbert and Michael Gallup right here, both guys who are playing about half of the Cowboys snaps. Tolbert, 3 straight games with 5 targets. Michael Gallup's targets kind of bounce around. But, Brandon Cooks, it's like he has a game of 10 targets, a game of 7. Every other game this year, he has 4. Jalen Tolbert has 3 straight games of 5 targets. So Brandon Cooks on the field a lot more, a better wide receiver all around, like a more seasoned wide receiver. But Tolbert has those opportunities to put up a nice score. So Romeo Doubs, Jaden Reed, another couple guys who kind of a little bit overlooked given like their paths to 20 points. So yeah, I mean, there's definitely some interesting ways to play around with things on this slate. Tucker Kraft should be filling in at tight end for Green Bay. So that's a nice way to save salary and maybe get a little bit different. And then you could always get crazy with the Seattle tight ends who can sort of randomly catch a touchdown pass. Defense, I don't really see ways to get too dramatically different because Commanders, Seahawks, Packers, all kind of just bad on paper plays. So I would kind of stick to these 3 higher owned, higher priced defenses. But again, you can see because people want to use game theory, they want to do things differently. 30% total ownership, 33% total ownership among these 3 bottom tier defenses. So that's still, 33% of the field that might just take the L at defense and give you that edge. If Tony Pollard puts up yet another 12-point game, and you don't roster him, that's 38.6% of the field that's just taking the L at that running back spot. So I think that there's a lot to play around with. And this is sort of the type of week where, I ingest ownership projections a lot more and then kind of use that to inform, like, how can I get different in the story that I want to tell?
Okay, so when you start your thought process, you start it with the ownership projections and then try and get different elsewhere.
Yeah, and obviously the mistake a lot of people make there is they see a low-owned player and then they just create a story of how that guy could hit. Like, we still want to play good plays, but we want to figure out how to leverage this ownership to kind of maneuver things in our direction.
Yeah, I think my thoughts are changing a little bit, like, as we're talking. But my original thoughts were, don't think about the ownership, make a good story, play a few separate ones on a few different single entry 3 max contests, and see what happens. But yeah, I like your strategy a lot.
It's been, and there's like crazy things happen, right? And when crazy things happen, they're amplified on small slate. So 2017, LeGarrette Blount had like one of the worst possible running back matchups, and he wasn't a good running back, and he scored 3 touchdowns on the ground. And because it's 2017, I think was maybe even before they'd added the Thursday night games, so it was probably a 2-game slate. But because of that, even though he was a bad play, he's still going to get 20 to 25 to 30% ownership, right? Yeah. So on like 2017 Thanksgiving slate, I didn't make money. And there's going to be slates like that. And I have to understand, again, because I'm playing single entry. Sometimes I think last year I played 3 max, but usually I play single entry on this slate. There's going to be years where I just don't make money because I'm not going to be on like the bad plays that could hit. But if I zoom out and I look like macro, most slates on this Thanksgiving slate, most years on this Thanksgiving slate, I end up profitable. And that's kind of because I think people lean too far into these bad plays saying like, ooh, maybe we get this LeGarrette Blount 3 touchdown game, and they spread out so much of their ownership hunting for that if you kind of play like just good plays around a cohesive story, you end up gaining a nice edge. One other thing, I think an interesting strategy angle, there was a question in the Oracle this week about leveraging late swap on this slate because they're, all 3 games are in 3 different time slots. And there's usually an hour between one game ending and another game starting. So you really have a lot of time to leverage late swap. So one of the things I noticed kind of trying to dig into my answer for that question was the Lions and Packers. They have, between those 2 teams, they have only 3 instances all season of a player scoring 27.7 or more DraftKings points. Sort of a arbitrary number, but we'll see kind of why I chose that number. But Amon-Ra St. Brown's done it twice. David Montgomery did it once, actually against the Packers earlier this year. The Cowboys have had 8 different players do it this year. So basically Green Bay's had nobody score 27.7 or more. The Lions have had 3. The Cowboys have had 8 guys do that. The Commanders have had 6 instances of that happening. The 49ers, I believe it was, have also had 8 instances of that happening. So there is edge in just not playing the early game. Because if Amon-Ra St. Brown does go for one of his sort of more rare 30-pointers, well, you can still catch that type of score later in the slate. You probably don't have the salary to play. You won't have the salary to play CMC and CeeDee Lamb and Amon-Ra St. Brown, or Kittle or Aiyuk and CeeDee Lamb and Amon-Ra St. Brown. So you can kind of be well, let me just see what happens in the first game and then build my roster after that. Because if there's just tons of ownership on Jared Goff and he puts up 23 points and St. Brown and he puts up 19, and players from the Green Bay side of this game. Now, granted, like we said, Romeo Doubs is kind of nice value. I don't even remember the name of the tight end, Kraft, I think it is nice value for the Packers at tight end, Tucker Kraft. And Jaden Reed is nice value at tight end, which, by the way, I had a bunch of Jaden Reed last week. Shout out to him for his 32-yard rushing touchdown that helped get me there last week. But yeah, there's certainly value in just being you know what, I'm going to leave this game alone altogether and then build a scenario around this game being sort of underwhelming, nobody putting up a score you had to have, and then you just sort of build out from these last 2 games on the slate. So I think that's an interesting angle to pursue on our sort of practice build here, just to kind of get a sense of what that might look like. And then that gives you massive flexibility to say, if St. Brown hits in the early window, then you recognize maybe I need to over prioritize adding a Kittle or Aiyuk or CMC to my CeeDee Lamb roster in order to maximize my chance of getting double 30-point scores. Whereas if St. Brown doesn't hit, you have a little bit more flexibility to say, to tell stories in a different way, right? Where maybe you're hey, maybe CeeDee Lamb hits, maybe nobody else goes for 30 plus. So then I can kind of go more mid-range. So you can maneuver around the way that you want to build based on what happens in that early game.
Okay, sweet. I kind of want to do what you're talking about with just taking the ownership on this with the Dak and CD, and then doing a little bring back with Logan Thomas.
Oh, I like that a lot. And I like it because Logan Thomas he's cheap. He's averaging 10 DraftKings points a game. Jake Ferguson's averaging 10.2. So they're kind of in that same range, but you get the bring back. Softest matchup, Cowboys obviously just a great defense all around, but the softest matchup against them is the tight end. Interesting stat that Hilo pulled up this week that the Cowboys have given up 6 touchdowns to tight ends. And then I think it's 6 touchdowns to running backs and 7 to wide receivers. Now, granted, that's with a 3-touchdown game to George Kittle, but it's just a softer matchup against tight ends than it is against wide receivers. Have been brutalized by the Cowboys defense this year. So yeah, that's a nice way to do that. Another thing to think about here is when we talk about how do we get a little bit unique, overstacks are going to be less common just because people don't lean into that as much. So something like Dak, CeeDee Lamb, and even 2 other pass catchers, going Brandon Cooks and Jalen Tolbert, or Brandon Cooks and Michael Gallup, because on this type of slate, you're not necessarily, if you miss, it's because the game itself is missing, right? And so because of that, if there's only 3 games, so if all 3 games kind of miss, you're not really killing yourself. But then you also give yourself that pathway that if the Cowboys put up 40 points and have a huge passing game against, look back to the Texans against the Bucs, right, where 3 different guys had 30 points, or even look at the Cowboys a couple weeks ago where Lamb had 40 and Brandon Cooks had like 35, right? It gives you that opportunity for, if the game plays out that type of way, you're getting all the points. So we don't necessarily have to lock that in just yet, but that gives us like something else to think about on this type of build.
I think maybe there are some people that have the same thought as me with this. I think there's like a underlying fear of the Cowboys defense being too good in this scenario, and maybe the Commanders cannot keep up, and the Cowboys just kind of slow it down near the second half. And the game just slows down as a whole, and they start running it more. What are your?
Couldn't we have had that fear against the Giants 2 weeks ago when they ended up putting up,
yeah, true.
Dak put up his monster game, CeeDee Lamb put up his monster game,
and
where so the Cowboys come out of the bye, they've been super pass heavy. They were pass heavy against the Rams. They were pass heavy against the Eagles, which everybody's pass heavy against the Eagles. They were pass heavy against the Giants, which you can run against them or pass against them. And then they played the Panthers, who they're hard to pass against, easy to run against. And the Cowboys, as we kind of expected, ended up being more run leaning in this spot. There's 2 things at play here. One, the Commanders, you can, same as the Giants, you can run or pass, but it's so easy to pass against them. I mean, they've just been brutalized by every passing attack. And then on top of that, the games where you typically see a team like keep their foot on the gas, like stomp on the opponent's throat type games, are usually divisional games. So we saw it in 2021 where that was the Bengals Super Bowl run, where the Bengals were like establishing themselves as a dominant team in the NFL. And all season, if they had a lead, they would play really conservatively. And then 2 times they played the Ravens, and both games, they just kept their foot on the gas the entire game. One of those games, Burrow had, I think it was over 500 passing yards in that game, and they won it like 41-17. And they were just like, look, we're the kings of the NFC North now, right? And so this is kind of a similar type of situation where with the Cowboys and the Giants a couple of weeks ago, playing a division opponent. Like I said, this is the most watched day of NFL football outside the Super Bowl. So good chance for the Cowboys to be like, hey, look, we're a dominant team. We're going to stomp on this division opponent. So no, I could see that fear, but I would lean, and I would think that fear is baked into the ownership that we're seeing and people leaning into Tony Pollard. Whereas I see it more like, yeah, but what if the Cowboys stomp on them and then it's not Tony Pollard getting a bunch of run, it's Rico Dowdle because the Cowboys are up by 3 scores halfway through the third quarter and they've taken the starters off the field. So, which you can even tell this story by putting Rico Dowdle onto this roster. You know what I mean? Like, that's a way that you, especially in large field play, if you're going to build a bunch of rosters, put him onto some of these Cowboys mega stacks. But I see that side of things, but I think that fear is sort of baked into the ownership we're seeing. And so we can also look at it from a different angle and see the pathways to this really hitting at a big level.
Okay, cool. Thank you for that. This is Thanksgiving slate seems like a very learning type of slate.
It really is. Yeah. It's good practice for, it's like larger than a showdown. It's obviously smaller than the main slate, but it's a lot of the same principles we want to apply on the main slate, but kind of in like a more compact space. And so it really allows us to lean into the principles that create winning DFS rosters as opposed to just solely picking players. Where with 10 games, 11 games, 12 games on a main slate, there's a lot more opportunities for all these little things that we pull in to like just not really play out. But on a smaller slate, you kind of have an opportunity to really look at exactly what might happen and how you can leverage that. So defense, any thoughts on, I mean, I really don't have any major thoughts on defense. The big games from Dak have all coincided with kind of lower games from the Cowboys defense. Makes sense because if the Cowboys defense is scoring a touchdown, then that's a full possession taken away from the Cowboys offense, right? It's like,
I was kind of thinking we don't play the Cowboys on this one and we play the
Lions. Yeah. So Lions, you're thinking, and that also would play into either thing that we could do next, which is either deciding let's just fade that Lions Packers game, or saying let's play both Lions running backs and bet on them just controlling this game on the ground. I mean, pull up these game logs for Gibbs and Montgomery these last 2 games where we see both of them scoring 20 plus each of the last 2 games. So we've got Gibbs there with, what was it, 26 and 21, and then Montgomery, okay, 17.8 and 20.6. So you put those together and you're getting about 40 points, from these two guys, which Brian Robinson could get you 20 points, with his pass catching role against the Cowboys. Charbonnet could get you 20 points with a pass catching role in a bad match against the 49ers. Pollard could get his second 20-point game of the entire season, but it's like very clearly like CMC could put up 20. Both these guys could put up around 20, and they could be like the top two highest scoring running backs on the slate, or number 1 and number 3, or number 2 and number 3. So I think it's an interesting angle to think about.
So Montgomery scares me a little bit just because it seems like those past 2 games, those points were touchdown reliant. But I'm still totally down to do both of them.
Yeah, I mean,
I guess so is Gibbs.
Yeah, they've combined for 5 touchdowns. They do have, like, the last time I looked, it was a couple weeks ago. Last time I looked, the Lions pass play rate in the red zone was like 39%. So a typical NFL team's pass play rate is like 55 to 60%. So 55 to 60% of the time they're going to throw the ball. You get up to, like, the Commanders are like 68, 69% of the time they throw the ball. The Lions, when they get in the red zone, they just like don't pass the ball. Like over 60% of the time, it's a run in the red zone. So that's sort of like the touch. I mean, that's why we saw Jamal Williams put up, what was it, 18 touchdowns last year. So like relying on touchdowns for our production is always a little bit scary because it's not as projectable. It's not as bankable, but we can kind of look and say, well, this is more bankable for the Lions than it would be for a typical team. So I definitely get that fear. I mean, I think that would be one of the reasons to be like, okay, well, let's build a roster without these guys. But it's definitely an interesting angle to play. And it creates one of these pathways where we can say, what would make our roster unique or different? This is one of the ways to do it for sure.
Man, we can grab Brandon Cooks too, and then get that extreme stack, or what, mega stack? Is that what you
mega stack? Yeah, we
mega
can go
stack.
We can go with Tolbert or Gallup if we want to. And then
what's Tolbert?
Tolbert, I think it's 3,200. Yeah, there's Tolbert, 3,100. So interestingly, this might give us enough for Brandon Aiyuk. It does. So yeah, this gives us just like a super, like, let's say the Cowboys pass for 4 touchdowns. Let's say the Lions rush for 4 touchdowns. We're just telling 2 stories, right? Yeah. Cowboys pass for 4 touchdowns, Lions rush for 4 touchdowns. And those 2 things happen, and we get, what is it, 4, 5, 6 of our roster spots right, and then Logan Thomas kind of trails that as the bring back. So we get really 7 roster spots right by getting 2 things right, two stories correct. Those are kind of extreme stories, but they're also stories that could very easily and very obviously play out. And then we also have Aiyuk at 21.9% projected ownership. So if we kind of get well, actually, there's really nothing that we could pivot off of. DK Metcalf, 23%, Aiyuk, 22%, Lockett, 19%. I was going to say, if we're kind of behind heading into that last game, we could pivot that last spot based on what we would need from that last spot. But kind of looks like we would just stick with that Brandon Aiyuk play. Obviously, could move to DK because it's fine to leave salary on the table. That's also another way to make our roster a little bit different, is get down to like DK Metcalf, leave some salary on the table. Even Tyler Lockett, leave some salary on the table. But yeah, man, I mean, this is a pretty sick roster. I almost wish we hadn't built the roster. Hey, this hasn't been published yet. We could just save this for ourselves. No, yeah, this is a really dope roster, and like just fits well with what works on slates like this, in terms of like the stories that we can tell, the ways that we can kind of put those stories together. So yeah, I like this. And I think it was a good discussion just around like how to attack this type of slate, but then also like you said, like a good learning experience for how to attack larger slates as well. You got any other thoughts on this before we move out?
Yeah, it's just funny seeing all the black Dallas pieces on there, where it's the highlighted DAL,
yeah,
on one roster. Man, I've never built something like this, so this is fun.
But we also see, Utica took down like everything a few weeks ago with a roster like this around the Texans. We see Osmo do rosters like this all the time, where it's a lot of weekends it's not going to hit, but the weekends when it does hit, nobody else is building this way, and so your so far ahead of the field. Because again, you know, I'll run through this real quickly, but it was talking on the Inner Circle podcast yesterday, which is our training or the Winner Circle podcast, which is our training podcast for Inner Circle members. And I was talking about like total points available from an offense, which is something people don't think about enough. And so a typical offense, they're like all their skill position points combined is going to be around 55 to 75 DraftKings points. So in other words, when you think like, you know, so you take Aiyuk, CMC, Kittle, Debo, what's their combined score on a given week? Usually for that team, it's usually going to be like 65 to 80 points. You take all the pieces of the Jags, put them, you know, Etienne, Ingram, Ridley, Kirk, put all their points together. It's usually going to be like 55 to 65 points. So when you think about like, can I get a 30-pointer from this offense? Well, you're kind of pulling from this bucket of the total points this offense is scoring, right? So I say that to say, and for this discussion, I say that to say that week against the Buccaneers, Houston's main pieces combined for 112 points. So typically you're getting like 55 to 75 points from all the skill position players on an offense. And that week, Houston skill position players combined for 112. So you see how these overstacks end up becoming so valuable, because on a week like that, where a team goes for, you know, or like the 2 weeks before Justin Fields got hurt, Cole Kmet and DJ Moore combined for 60 and 70 points, just the two of them. So those weeks where like things hit at a really high level, you know, Justin Fields throws 4 touchdown passes, like people aren't building for that scenario. And so you get all the points and move past everybody. And then the weeks where they kind of hit like just that moderate outcome, you still get all the points, and, you know, you take one dud on your roster, but a lot of times people take one dud on their roster with their stacks from other games. So it just is really a valuable way to approach DFS in general. And it's part of the reason it's valuable is because it's so underused. So on a small slate, again, it's like a differentiator, a nice way to get ahead of the field. And yeah, just a cool way to build on this particular slate. So there obviously, say this to you guys watching, listening to this, there's a lot of different ways to attack a slate like this. This is just one potential way to attack. So this is not saying like, this is the way that you should attack, or saying this is the way that that's going to be like the winning pathway on this particular week. So take this discussion more as how to think through a slate like this, and then build your rosters around whatever stories you want to tell. But at the same time, this is kind of the clearest pathway for this slate to play out. And so this is one of the pathways that you can consider, in some different ways you can build interesting rosters around it. Fun show. Keegan, any final thoughts before we get out of here?
Happy Thanksgiving, everybody.
Happy Thanksgiving. What are you doing tomorrow?
I'm going over to my in-laws.
Okay, right on. Nice. Cool. Well, I'll see you at some point this next, I think we come back to Oklahoma on Saturday, and then we're, I think, out at the cottage until like Thursday or something like that. So I don't know. I'm sure I'll see you at some point this next week, but I'll see you, and we'll see you guys on the site. Again, those Black Friday deals, go check those out. I'm going to go find out if my DraftKings account is back up and running, if I'll be able to play this slate or not. And we will see you guys on OWS throughout the weekend. We will see you back here for the DraftKings main slate DFS Lab on Saturday, FanDuel DFS Lab on Friday, and we will see you at the top of the leaderboards on Thanksgiving.